The altimeter needle slid past 17,000 feet and kept climbing, even though the C-47 was already straining beyond its comfort zone. Ice crawled up the windshield like frosted spiderwebs. Outside, there was nothing but black night and the dull glow of lightning flickering in the clouds. Somewhere ahead, invisible in the blizzard of snow and cloud, a wall of rock rose another 3,000 or 4,000 feet straight into the sky. Lieutenant Jack Reynolds could feel the controls getting heavy under his hands. The overloaded transport wanted to sink, not climb. In the back of the aircraft, 6,000 pounds of gasoline sloshed in steel drums, the liquid hammering inside them with every gust, trying to shove the aircraft sideways. If a drum broke loose in the turbulence, it could tear the fuselage in half. The co-pilot called out the airspeed, the numbers sagging dangerously toward stall. The flight engineer tapped the glass of the manifold pressure gauge as if he could will a few more inches out of the pair of Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engines, beating themselves to death out on the wings. Oxygen masks rasped in the thin air. The radio operator tried, and failed, to raise base. The only thing that answered was static and an occasional burst of lightning that lit the cockpit in a ghostly blue. Beneath them, invisible, lay jungle so thick that even in peacetime it swallowed villages whole. Beyond that jungle, the shoulders of the eastern Himalayas pushed the storm clouds upward like a dam in the sky. Japanese planners had once looked at those mountains and judged them impassable. Once Burma fell, they believed, China would be cut off from outside help. But Jack Reynolds and hundreds of young men like him were out here proving otherwise, one dangerous crossing at a time. Their C-47s were drawing a new line across the map over what pilots called, with a mix of pride and dread, the Hump. The mission tonight was simple to describe and almost impossible to carry out. Get fuel and ammunition to the hungry airfields around Kunming, so that the war in China could go on one more day. It was the spring of 1943. From the steaming Brahmaputra Valley in Assam, British India, a 500-mile air route clawed its way up from airfields like Chabwa and Dinjan, across northern Burma, and down into western China. The valley floor sat barely above sea level. The mountains surrounding it rose abruptly to 10,000 feet and higher, forcing transport aircraft to climb almost as fast as they could after takeoff, just to avoid granite. Above that, the monsoon brewed storms that could tear wings from a fuselage. This is the story of how that route came to exist, and how the humble C-47 Skytrain and its crews turned geography itself into a weapon. Japan had closed the Burma Road and believed the Himalayas would finish the job. Instead, an improvised airlift became the largest and most dangerous strategic supply bridge the world had ever seen, carrying hundreds of thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and men into China, at the cost of hundreds of aircraft and well over 1,000 lives. Long before Lieutenant Reynolds fought that storm, Japan had already reshaped the map of Asia. In 1942, its armies swept through Burma, capturing Rangoon and seizing the crossings that fed the Burma Road, the twisting 700-mile highway that linked the port with China's interior. For Chiang Kai-shek's embattled government in Chongqing, that road had been a lifeline. When it was cut, supply estimates turned from hard arithmetic into pure despair. In Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt wrote to his Army Chief of Staff that the connection to China had to be kept open at almost any cost. China tied down vast numbers of Japanese troops. If it collapsed, Tokyo would be free to send divisions and aircraft elsewhere. The only possible replacement for the lost road was the sky. A few people had already tested that idea. As early as November 1941, pilots of the China National Aviation Corporation, CNAC, a joint Chinese-American airline, had nudged Douglas DC-3s over the eastern edge of the Himalayas. They flew without good charts or reliable weather reports, navigating by dead reckoning and river valleys, sometimes turning back when clouds turned the passes into solid white walls. These were tentative experiments, more daredevil route hunting than organized logistics. Then Pearl Harbor was attacked, the United States came into the war, and caution gave way to urgency. 10 Air Corps transports were committed to help CNAC, and a new command in India began stitching together something called the India-China Ferry. It was not yet an official unit, more a concept held together by telegraph messages and a handful of men who believed they could do the impossible. In April 1942, a Knack DC-3 lifted off from Dinjan, loaded with aviation gasoline for bombers waiting in China. It was one of the first true cargo flights over the Hump. Its pilot, Captain Moon Chin, a Chinese-American aviator from Baltimore, would soon gain a reputation for threading his way through weather that grounded other crews. On one of his flights, he carried Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle and several other Tokyo Raiders out of China after their famous strike on Japan, slipping through Burma just ahead of advancing Japanese forces to bring them back to India. That early period was a mix of heroism and chaos. The U.S. Army Air Forces had no real doctrine for large-scale cargo operations. There were too few aircraft, too few trained crews, and not enough usable airfields. The transports themselves were a patchwork of models: civilian DC-3s on loan, early C-47 Skytrains just arriving from American factories, and older C-39s and C-53s pressed into service. On a good day, only 2/3 of the aircraft were flyable. The C-47, though, was already starting to show what it could do. Derived from the DC-3 airliner, the Skytrain had a wingspan of just under 96 feet, twin radial engines each producing roughly 1,200 to 1,350 horsepower, and a payload capacity of about 6,000 pounds or 28 fully equipped troops. It could cruise around 160 miles per hour, and in theory it could reach altitudes above 26,000 feet. On paper, that was enough to climb over much of the terrain between India and China, if the weather cooperated. The engines did not overheat, and the crew kept their nerve. In reality, the weather almost never cooperated. The Brahmaputra Valley at Chabua sat barely above sea level, but the ridge beyond rose almost sheer. Pilots had to haul their aircraft to 12,000 or 14,000 feet within minutes of takeoff, threading through passes that might be clear one day and buried under thunderstorms the next. There were few radio beacons, almost no reliable oxygen equipment early on, and crude maps that sometimes placed mountains miles from their true position. Many pilots were flying multi-engine aircraft and instruments for the first time in their lives. The dangers were not theoretical. In early 1943, even the commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Forces found himself at the mercy of the route. General Henry Hap Arnold flew from India to Kunming in his B-17 after the Casablanca Conference, eager to see the Hump operations for himself. The flight took off at night. Tailwinds blew stronger than forecast, radio navigation beacons failed, and the crew overshot their destination by a wide margin. With fuel running down and mountains hidden in darkness, they finally managed to catch a homing signal from Kunming and turn back, landing hours overdue. If a top-level mission with the best crew and equipment in the theater could stumble like that, the risk to ordinary transport pilots needed no further explanation. In the first months, the tonnage figures were dismal. During the spring and summer of 1942, U.S. aircraft delivered only a few hundred tons of cargo per month to China, while CNAC added a modest few hundred more. General Joseph Stilwell, trying desperately to rebuild a Chinese army capable of fighting in Burma, watched the numbers and seethed. Chiang Kai-shek's staff insisted that they needed at least 7,500 tons per month just to keep Chinese field divisions operating. That figure remained out of reach for more than a year. Meanwhile, Japanese officers celebrated what they saw as a strategic success. By closing the Burma Road and holding northern Burma, they believed they had sealed China off from heavy equipment and fuel. Without outside support, they expected the Chinese nationalist government to wither, or at least to be unable to mount large-scale offensives. Geography seemed to favor them. The eastern Himalayas were among the highest, least accessible mountains on Earth. No one had ever tried to run an industrial-scale supply line over such terrain by air, but the map was already beginning to change. Back in Assam, the India-China ferry was transformed into a more coherent organization. First the India-China wing of Air Transport Command. Then, as it grew, the India-China division. New airfields were hacked out of tea plantations and paddies. Places like Chabwa, Mohanbari, Jorhat, and Tezpur. Concrete runways replaced dirt strips that had turned to soup in the monsoon. Engineers named routes with simple phonetic letters, Abel, Baker, Charlie, later Nan and Fox, tracing ragged lines across maps that had been nearly blank a year before. C-47 pilots were the scouts of this new geography. They learned, pass by pass, where the worst turbulence hid, which valleys funneled winds into deadly downdrafts, and where cloud decks tended to form. Many of them were barely out of flight school, 23 or 24 years old. Their training had taught them how to fly by instruments and handle an engine failure. It had not prepared them for lightning that could knock out every radio at once, or for mountain waves that could throw a loaded aircraft 1,000 feet up or down in seconds. One pilot later described flying into a clear, moonlit night, and suddenly seeing the mountains ahead lit by reflected starlight, only to realize that what he thought were snowfields were actually the twisted aluminum remains of earlier crashes glinting on the ridgelines. Crews began referring to the Hump route not just by its official name, but by darker nicknames, the Skyway to Hell and the Aluminum Trail. They were jokes, but nervous ones. For Lieutenant Reynolds and his crew, those wrecks were a constant silent reminder. On a daytime crossing, they sometimes spotted the broken backs of C-47s and C-46 scattered along the jungle slopes, their olive-drab paint fading as vines swallowed them. If the wind pushed them off course, those wrecks became grisly navigational aids, proof that others had been there before and had not come back. Yet the airlift grew. In 1943, as Air Transport Command took over the effort, tonnage began to climb. That summer, the combined flow from C-47s, the larger C-46 commandos, and a handful of adapted bombers finally passed the 7,500-ton mark in a single month. Soon the goals were raised again, 10,000 tons per month, then 20,000, then more. Most of what went into China was fuel. Gasoline and oil accounted for well over half of the total cargo delivered by ATC transports, hundreds of thousands of tons over the life of the airlift. Without that fuel, the fighters and bombers of the U.S. 14th Air Force and Chinese units could not fly, trucks could not move, and factories assembling weapons from Lend-Lease components could not run. In a real sense, every C-47 grinding its way over the passes carried the ability of China's armies to keep fighting. The work was relentless. A typical day for a C-47 crew began in the dark, with engines starting before dawn. The pilots checked that their cargo was properly lashed drums of fuel, ammunition boxes, sometimes disassembled vehicles or aircraft parts. They scanned weather reports that were always incomplete, and sometimes wildly wrong. Then, when briefed and loaded, they rolled onto a narrow strip, with jungle crowding close on either side, pushed the throttles forward, and waited to see whether the heavy aircraft would lift before the end of the runway. Once airborne, they followed the river east until the valley tightened, and the only way forward was up. At 10,000 feet, they donned oxygen masks. At 14,000, frost began to creep up inside the cockpit, and the engines had to be managed carefully to avoid overheating. At 16,000 or 18,000, depending on the route and the day's weather, they prayed that the peaks ahead would be below them. If clouds swallowed the ridges, they flew into the whiteness and trusted their altimeters and compasses, acutely aware that any error in those instruments could be fatal. Sometimes, the danger was not the mountains, but what lay beyond them. For much of 1942 and early 1943, Japanese fighters based at Myitkyina and other Burma airfields could reach part of the route. A slow transport, silhouetted against snow or clouds, was an inviting target. Crews usually flew alone, separated in altitude and distance to avoid collisions. If one ran into enemy aircraft, there was rarely help nearby. The C-47's only defense was its modest speed, a bit of maneuvering, and the hope that cloud would hide it. Combat losses, though, were only a fraction of the price. The real killer was the environment itself. By the time the airlift ended, roughly 600 transports of all types had been lost on the Hump routes, and more than 1,500 airmen had died or gone missing. Many of their bodies were never recovered. Their aircraft simply vanished into the maze of jungle valleys and snow fields. Even today, hikers in India, Myanmar, and China occasionally stumble on twisted aluminum and faded U.S. markings in the undergrowth. Out of that grim reality grew one of the war's earliest organized search and rescue units. In mid-1943, a veteran test pilot and Hump flyer, Captain John Blackie Porter, began informally borrowing C-47s to go looking for missing aircraft. His small band of volunteers, pilots, medics, mechanics, even some men who had once been barnstormers in the United States, carried rifles and medical kits, parachuting into remote crash sites when they could be found. They hacked landing strips into jungle clearings or improvised rope ladders on cliffs. Eventually, Blackie's gang was given official status, a pair of C-47s, some liaison aircraft, and even a couple of worn B-25s pulled from the salvage yard. In 1943 alone, they recovered nearly every airman who had any chance of survival. One of their most famous rescues brought out CBS correspondent Eric Severide and 19 others who had bailed out of a crippled transport over the jungle. The stories of survival from those crashes became legends among crews. One pilot walked for weeks through jungle guided by villagers, living on a handful of rice per day. Another crew bailed out into a storm and landed strung along a ridge, each man believing he was the only survivor, until they heard each other shouting in the dark. For every such story, though, there were others where the jungle and mountains kept their secrets. As 1944 approached, the Hump began to change again. American and Chinese forces fighting under Stilwell and later under General Albert Wedemeyer pushed slowly through northern Burma. In May 1944, they captured the airfield at Myitkyina after a brutal siege. The Japanese lost their most important forward base for intercepting transports. Almost at once, Myitkyina became an emergency strip for Hump aircraft and a forward base for Allied fighters that could escort loaded transports through some of the most dangerous stretches. More important, the capture of Myitkyina allowed planners to carve a lower, more direct route, the so-called low hump. Larger four-engine C-54 transports, which could carry roughly 10 tons of cargo, soon joined the flow along this path. The C-47 did not vanish. It remained the flexible workhorse, ideal for shorter strips and secondary routes. But the airlift's sheer capacity now jumped. By mid-1944, General William Tunner took command of the India-China Division. He is better known today for orchestrating the Berlin airlift after the war, but in the CBI theater he was already earning a reputation as the master of large-scale air transport. Tunner imposed rigorous procedures, emphasized maintenance and training, and demanded that flights run with the regularity of a conveyor belt rather than the improvisation of the early days. Under his leadership, the Hump reached a peak tempo of more than 300 flights a day. The division's strength eventually included more than 600 aircraft, with C-47s still a significant share of that fleet. By the summer of 1945, the results were staggering. Over the course of the operation, roughly 650,000 tons of supplies had been carried eastward into China fuel, ammunition, machinery, medical supplies, and vehicles. Chinese sources later estimated that more than 80% of the wartime aid delivered to China arrived via the Hump. The Lado Road, eventually carved through the jungle as a replacement for the old Burma Road, delivered barely a quarter of that tonnage by comparison. For Japanese planners, the mountain barrier that had seemed like a solid wall had been quietly turned into a door. Every drum of aviation gasoline that rolled off a C-47 at Kunming or Changkung meant more sorties for the fighters of Claire Chennault's 14th Air Force, more raids on Japanese shipping, more close air support for Chinese ground offensives. Every crate of ammunition and medical gear helped keep Chinese divisions in the field that otherwise might have withered. On the ground in China, the impact was visible. Pilots of the 14th Air Force remembered brief periods when fuel stocks ran low and flying was sharply curtailed. They also remembered the day when a long line of Dakotas and commandos began landing, disgorging fuel trucks and drums that once again filled their tanks. Chinese soldiers manning anti-aircraft positions near Kunming watched those transports thunder overhead and understood that somewhere beyond the clouds, men they would never meet were risking their lives to keep the war going. For the crews themselves, the numbers mattered less than the routine. Lieutenant Reynolds survived his night crossing. After agonizing minutes in the storm, the C-47 slipped out of the worst of the weather. A gap opened in the clouds, and for a few heartbeats the moon lit a jagged ridge, close enough that he could almost imagine reaching out and touching it. Then the aircraft cleared the crest, and the altimeter began to unwind as they eased down toward China. On that particular flight, they brought in gasoline that would feed P-40 fighters at a dusty airstrip outside Kunming. The next day, those fighters rose into the sky to intercept Japanese bombers probing toward the city. Reynolds and his crew were not there to see it. They were already on the westbound leg, the C-47 now empty but no less vulnerable, heading back over the same mountains to pick up another load. That was the rhythm of the Hump. Out and back, again and again, in good weather and bad, until days blurred into months. Many crews completed hundreds of crossings. Some never finished their first. By the end, the India-China Division had logged more than 1.5 million flying hours over the route and officially expended nearly 600 aircraft in the process. After the war, most of the C-47s moved on to new jobs. Some became airliners once again, carrying passengers along peaceful routes. Others hauled cargo in new conflicts or flew paratroopers in training. A few were left where they fell in the mountains, their aluminum slowly turning dull under layers of moss and snow. Yet the map they helped draw did not fade. The Hump was the first sustained strategic air bridge in history to operate over such extreme terrain, and its lessons shaped later operations, including Tunner's own Berlin airlift. It proved that geography, even mountain ranges once thought untouchable, could be bent to human purpose if enough courage, engineering, and sheer stubbornness were applied. Japan had believed that by seizing Burma and trusting in the Himalayas, it could isolate China and decide the war in Asia on its own terms. Instead, C-47 sky trains and their sister transports traced shimmering white contrails over the roof of the world, carrying fuel and steel and hope. They turned an impassable wall into a narrow, perilous hallway, through which an entire nation's war effort squeezed. On some nights, when the moon was bright and the air clear, crews could look down and see the glint of wrecked aircraft guiding their path like a grim chain of mile markers. On others, they saw nothing at all, only cloud and darkness and the faint glow of instruments. But they kept going. Flight by flight, crossing by crossing, they redrew the map of the war, until the Himalayas were no longer an end of the world, but a dangerous, familiar corridor on the way to China.